Here's the paradox no one talks about. The US dollar is backed by 800 military bases across 80 countries, the most powerful economy on Earth, and $36 trillion in treasury bonds held by every central bank on the planet. And yet, this exact same strength is precisely what destroyed the British pound in 1956. This isn't about conspiracy theories or doomsday predictions. This is documented history, repeating with mathematical precision. Most analysts focus on debt ceilings and inflation numbers. They're looking at symptoms. Today we're going to examine the same mechanism that ended 200 years of British dominance in exactly 11 years. To understand why 2027 matters, we first need to travel back to a trading floor in London, 1945. Picture the London Stock Exchange, October 1945. Marble columns carved with the names of colonial territories, India, Hong Kong, Singapore, Nigeria. Men in bowler hats shouting orders across the trading floor. Cigarette smoke hanging in the air like fog. Above everything, the Union Jack still and proud. Harold Whitmore was 34 years old that autumn, a junior partner at Barings Bank, standing beneath those marble columns with a leather satchel containing settlement documents worth £12 million. If you could see his face in that moment, chin lifted, shoulders squared, you would see absolute certainty. The British Empire had just defeated Hitler. The Royal Navy still ruled the seas. The pound sterling settled 60% of every international transaction on Earth. Harold would retire in 1982, having watched the pound lose 94% of its purchasing power. But on that October morning, if you had whispered to him that the empire had exactly 11 years left, he would have laughed in your face. Now hold that image. We're going to need it. The number that should keep American investors awake at night is not the $36 trillion national debt. It's not the $1.5 trillion annual interest payment. It's a smaller stranger number 11. 11 years. That's how long it took for Britain to go from undisputed financial superpower to a second-rate economy begging the International Monetary Fund for emergency loans. From 1945, when the pound controlled global finance, to 1956, when a single phone call from Washington ended the British Empire, 11 years. And America right now is 16 years past its first major crack. Consider what most people get wrong about reserve currencies. They imagine collapse as a sudden event, a dramatic crash, a single catastrophic day when everything falls apart. They picture breadlines and bank runs. Hollywood has trained us to expect explosions. But that's not how empires end. Margaret Chen still remembers the exact moment she understood. She was 26 in March 2023, a treasury analyst at Goldman Sachs sitting in a windowless conference room in Lower Manhattan when her managing director pulled up a single chart. It showed foreign central bank holdings of U.S. Treasury bonds from 2015 to 2023. The line didn't crash. It didn't spike. It simply bent quietly, gradually, unmistakably downward. China had reduced holdings by $530 billion. Japan by $220 billion. Nobody's selling in a panic, her director said, his voice flat. They're walking toward the exits. That's worse. Walking toward the exits. Remember that phrase. It's going to matter. Here's the first question that should unsettle you. If the dollar is so strong, if American military dominance is so overwhelming, if the Treasury bond is still the safest asset on Earth, then why are America's closest allies quietly reducing their dollar exposure every single quarter? The answer is not complicated. It's just uncomfortable. In 1946, Britain was forced to accept the Anglo-American loan, $3.75 billion from the United States, with conditions that systematically dismantled British trade preferences and opened the empire to American competition. The men who negotiated that loan believed they were saving Britain. In reality, they were purchasing an empire at a 90% discount. Lord Keynes, Britain's chief negotiator, returned from Washington looking like a ghost. His wife later wrote that he aged 10 years in 6 weeks. He told Parliament the loan was an essential condition of our survival. He did not mention that survival meant slow surrender. Now watch the mirror image form. Robert Blackwell spent 42 years at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. He retired in 2019, just before the COVID money printing began. When I spoke with him last year, he sat in his Connecticut study surrounded by framed photographs of Fed chairmen he had served under Volcker Greenspan Bernanke. His hands trembled slightly as he held his coffee cup. "We printed $7 trillion between 2008 and 2020, he said. Then another $5 trillion during COVID. That's not monetary policy. That's—" He paused, searching for words that wouldn't sound alarmist. "That's the same path Britain walked. We just convinced ourselves it was different because we were bigger." Why does size make Americans feel safe when size didn't save Britain? Between 2020 and 2024, the Federal Reserve increased the money supply by over 600%. But American production of actual goods did not increase 600%. The mathematics here is elementary. More dollars chasing the same amount of products means each dollar buys less. This is called inflation in textbooks. In reality, it's the slow-motion robbery of everyone holding dollars, including every foreign central bank, that trusted the American monetary system. And those central banks are watching. Ahmed al-Rashid manages currency reserves for a sovereign wealth fund in the Gulf. He won't say which country his position requires discretion. But during a conference in Zurich last year, he described his instructions from senior leadership in a single sentence. Reduce dollar exposure by 3% annually. Do it quietly. Do not trigger headlines. 3% per year doesn't sound dramatic. But compound that across 40 sovereign wealth funds, 100 central banks, and a decade of quiet accumulation of alternatives, gold, yuan, euros, anything but dollars, and you begin to see the shape of what's coming. The pound didn't collapse in a day. It bled out over 11 years while British bankers insisted the system was permanent. There is a date circled on calendars in treasury departments from Beijing to Riyadh to Moscow. Not because anyone announced it. Not because of some coordinated conspiracy. But because the mathematics converge there with uncomfortable precision. That date is 2027. And to understand why that year matters, we have to go back to a canal in Egypt and the phone call that ended an empire in 48 hours. To understand how reserve currencies die, you first need to understand how they're born. Most people assume reserve currencies exist because governments are powerful. That's backward. Governments become powerful because their currencies become reserve currencies. The mechanism works in reverse. In 1821, Britain did something no major nation had ever done. The Bank of England announced that anyone holding a British pound note could walk through their doors and exchange that paper for exactly 113 grains of pure gold. No questions asked. No limits. No exceptions. This was not a promise. This was a contract. Picture what this meant for a merchant in Shanghai or Buenos Aires or New York. If you were selling wheat or cotton or copper, you had a choice. Accept payment in French francs, Dutch guilders, Spanish pesos, currencies backed by nothing but the word of foreign kings, or accept British pounds, which you could convert into physical gold that your grandchildren could still spend a century later. The choice was obvious. Everyone wanted pounds. Think of it like a crowded marketplace where 90 vendors accept only cash, but one vendor, just one, accepts both cash and gold-backed receipts that never expire. Within a year, every merchant in that market is demanding those receipts. Within a decade, the receipts become more valuable than cash. The vendor who issues the receipts can now borrow from everyone else at almost no interest because holding his receipts is safer than holding anything else. This is the reserve currency privilege, and it creates an almost irresistible temptation. By 1900, 60% of global trade was denominated in pounds. When a German bank loaned money to a Brazilian railroad, the loan was in pounds. When Japan bought American machinery, they paid in pounds. The British pound became the oxygen of international commerce. invisible, essential everywhere. Here's what most people get wrong about this privilege. They imagine it as strength. It is actually a trap. Because once the world depends on your currency, you can print more of it than you actually have. You can spend more than you earn. You can import real goods, food oil manufactured products, and export paper. For a while, no one notices. The system runs on inertia and trust. And trust, once established, takes decades to destroy. But it does destroy. And the destruction follows a precise pattern. Remember Harold Whitmore from Part 1, the young Barings banker standing beneath those marble columns in 1945, certain the empire would last forever. His father, William Whitmore, had stood on that same trading floor in August 1914, when the Bank of England made an announcement that would ultimately doom the pound. Due to the emergency of war, gold convertibility was temporarily suspended. Temporarily. William Whitmore was 51 years old that summer. He wrote in his diary that the suspension would last perhaps 6 months, no more. He died in 1952, still waiting for gold convertibility to return. It never did. This is the first mini-climax, the first crack in the foundation. The moment a reserve currency breaks its gold promise. Even temporarily, it crosses a line that cannot be uncrossed. The paper is no longer a receipt for something real. It becomes a receipt for trust. And trust can evaporate. But Britain didn't fall in 1914. The pound remained dominant for another 4 decades. Why inertia? The world had built its entire financial infrastructure around pounds. Contracts were written in pounds. Debts were denominated in pounds. Banks held pounds as reserves. Switching to another currency would require rewriting millions of agreements, retraining thousands of bankers, rebuilding decades of institutional knowledge. Easier to pretend the system still worked. If this sounds familiar, it should. The dollar has been running on the same inertia since 1971. Evelyn Hartley was a junior economist at the Treasury Department in August 1971, when President Nixon appeared on television and announced that the United States would no longer convert dollars to gold. She was 28, fresh from her PhD at MIT, watching history through a 12-inch black and white screen in a cramped Washington apartment. "We all knew it was coming," she told an interviewer 40 years later. "We'd been bleeding gold for years, but hearing it spoken aloud, that was different. That was the moment the rules changed." The rules did change. But here's the contrarian point most analysts miss. Nixon's decision didn't weaken the dollar immediately. For the next 50 years, the dollar actually became more dominant. How is that possible? Because Nixon replaced one mechanism with another. The gold standard linked dollars to a physical metal. Nixon replaced it with the petrodollar, an informal agreement with Saudi Arabia that all global oil sales would be denominated exclusively in dollars. Since every industrial nation on Earth needs oil, every nation needed dollars to buy it. The demand for dollars became structural, permanent, inescapable. This was elegant. It was also unstable. Because while gold sits in vaults and maintains its value across centuries, oil is a political commodity. And political agreements can be broken. Karim Nazari still remembers the phone call that changed his understanding of everything. He was 43 in March 2023, a senior energy analyst at a Dubai investment bank, when his contact at Saudi Aramco mentioned almost casually that preliminary discussions had begun about accepting yuan for Chinese oil purchases. "The Americans won't let that happen," Karim said. His contact laughed. "The Americans are not in charge anymore." Hold that phrase. We're coming back to it. The mechanism of reserve currency death is now clear. First, you make promises: gold convertibility, stable value, fiscal discipline. Second, you break those promises during an emergency, calling it temporary. Third, you replace the original promise with a new arrangement, buying time. Fourth, that replacement arrangement begins to fray as alternatives emerge. Fifth, and this is where Britain was in 1956, where America is today, the system reaches a point where the mathematics no longer work. What do the mathematics say right now? In 2008, America's national debt was $10 trillion. Today, it exceeds $36 trillion. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet, the amount of money created from nothing, went from $900 billion in 2008 to over $8 trillion by 2022. Interest payments on the debt now consume more federal revenue than the entire defense budget. If you visualize the trajectory on a graph, the line doesn't curve upward gradually anymore. It bends vertical like a rocket lifting off. And yet the dollar still dominates global reserves at 58%. Treasury bonds are still considered the safest asset in the world. American consumers still import cheap goods while exporting paper. The system appears stable. It appeared stable in Britain, too. Right up until October 1956. Remember Robert Blackwell, the retired Fed official from Part 1. Trembling hands wrapped around his coffee cup, saying $12 trillion of money printing wasn't monetary policy, but something else. He never finished that sentence. What he meant, what he couldn't bring himself to say, was that America has been rehearsing Britain's 1914-1956 playbook for 15 years. We're not approaching the breaking point. We're past the warning markers. The question is not whether the mechanism will complete itself. The question is what triggers the final break. And for that, we need to travel to a canal in Egypt where a single phone call ended 2 centuries of British supremacy in 48 hours. October 29, 1956. The Egyptian desert. British paratroopers are dropping from the sky over the Suez Canal. French warships are shelling Egyptian positions. Israeli tanks are rolling across the Sinai Peninsula. 3 armies converging on a single waterway that carries 2/3 of Europe's oil supply. From a military standpoint, the operation is flawless. Within 48 hours, British and French forces control the canal zone. Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser's army is in full retreat. The mission objectives are achieved. Victory is complete. And then the phone rings. Sir Anthony Eden, British Prime Minister, takes the call in his private study at 10 Downing Street. On the other end is President Dwight Eisenhower. The conversation lasts less than 4 minutes. When Eden hangs up, his hands are shaking. His private secretary later described his face as the color of old paper. Eisenhower's message was simple. Withdraw from Egypt within 24 hours or the United States will crash the pound. Not threaten, not pressure. Crash. Here's what most people get wrong about the Suez Crisis. They remember it as a military defeat or a diplomatic humiliation. It was neither. Britain won the military battle. Britain had international law on its side. Nasser had illegally nationalized a canal built with British capital. Britain's position was defensible. None of that mattered. Because Eisenhower held a weapon more powerful than any army. The mechanism was elegant and devastating. The United States Treasury held enormous reserves of British pounds accumulated during World War II, when America supplied Britain with weapons and food. If the Treasury began selling those pounds on the open market, the pound's value would collapse within hours. British imports would become unaffordable. Inflation would spike. The British economy would crater. Pause for a moment and consider what this means. The most powerful empire in modern history, an empire that had dominated global finance for 2 centuries, was brought to its knees, not by enemy soldiers, but by a phone call from an ally threatening to sell its currency. This is the moment the British Empire ended, not on a battlefield, not in a treaty negotiation, in a currency attack that lasted less than 1 business day. George Pemberton was a 38-year-old currency trader at the Bank of England that week. He worked the overnight desk, monitoring pound sterling positions across global markets. When the sell orders started coming in from New York, American institutions dumping pounds by the millions, he called his supervisor at home. "It's coordinated," he said. "This isn't normal market activity." His supervisor's response was 3 words: "I know. Pray." The pound fell 7% in 72 hours. Britain's gold reserves, already depleted from 2 world wars, hemorrhaged at a rate that would have emptied them within 6 weeks. The Chancellor of the Exchequer performed emergency calculations showing that without American support, Britain could not afford to import food by Christmas. Eden withdrew from Egypt. He resigned 2 months later officially for health reasons. The real reason was that he had just learned the most important lesson of the 20th century. Reserve currency status is not power. It is dependency, and the nation that controls the reserve currency controls everyone who uses it. Now let me ask you a question that should make you uncomfortable. If America could weaponize the dollar against Britain in 1956, could someone weaponize it against America today? Remember Karim Nazari from Part 2. The Dubai energy analyst whose Saudi Aramco contact laughed and said, "The Americans are not in charge anymore." That conversation happened 6 months before something unprecedented occurred. In March 2023, Saudi Arabia announced it was considering accepting yuan for Chinese oil purchases. Not as a replacement for dollars, just as an option. The financial press treated it as a curiosity, a negotiating tactic, background noise. It was none of those things. It was the first crack in the petrodollar, the informal agreement that has kept dollar demand artificially high since Nixon closed the gold window in 1971. If you visualize global oil flows as a massive river system, with the dollar as the only bridge every boat must cross, then Saudi Arabia just announced they're building a second bridge. Here's the first twist nobody talks about. America used the dollar as a weapon against Russia in 2022, freezing $300 billion in Russian central bank reserves after the Ukraine invasion. The message was clear: if you cross America, your dollars become worthless. Every central banker on Earth received that message. And every central banker on Earth drew the same conclusion: holding dollars means holding an asset that can be confiscated at American discretion. China reduced Treasury holdings by $530 billion over the next 18 months. Japan reduced by $220 billion. Saudi Arabia began quiet negotiations with Beijing. Brazil and Argentina announced they would settle bilateral trade in local currencies. India started paying for Russian oil in rupees. These are not random events. This is coordinated de-dollarization. The same slow walk toward the exits that Margaret Chen, the Goldman analyst from Part 1, saw in her conference room chart. The line bending down, not crashing. Bending. The second twist is darker. Remember Robert Blackwell, the retired Fed official who couldn't finish his sentence about what $12 trillion in money printing actually represented? He contacted me 2 months after our first interview. He had been thinking about our conversation. There was something else he wanted to say. The people making these decisions, he said, his voice careful. They know the mathematics. They know the trajectory. They're not stupid. He paused. They're just not planning to be here when the bill comes due. Let that sink in. The officials who authorized the money printing, the politicians who ran up the debt, the central bankers who enabled the deficits, they understand exactly what they've done. They understand that the dollar's reserve status is eroding. They understand that 2027 represents a convergence of crises that cannot be solved with more printing. And they are positioning their own assets accordingly. Victoria Langston spent 23 years as a compliance officer at one of the largest private banks in Switzerland. She retired in 2021. When I asked her what she observed about American clients over the past decade, she answered with a single statistic: applications for offshore accounts from U.S. government officials and their family members increased 400% between 2016 and 2021. 400%. The people who created this crisis are quietly moving their wealth outside the dollar system. The people who will pay for this crisis, working Americans with savings accounts, retirement funds, and mortgages denominated in dollars, have no idea what's coming. This is the rage moment. This is the part that should make your blood boil. When Britain's reserve currency collapsed, ordinary British families watched their purchasing power evaporate over the next 3 decades. A pound that bought a week's groceries in 1956 bought a day's groceries by 1980. Meanwhile, the British aristocracy, the families who had dominated the empire for generations, had already converted their wealth into land gold and foreign assets. The pattern is repeating. Exactly. Daniel Morrison is 44 years old, a high school history teacher in Ohio with $180,000 in his 403B retirement account, all invested in treasury bonds because his financial advisor told him they were the safest investment on earth. When I explained the reserve currency cycle to him, the same mechanism that destroyed British savings. After 1956, he stared at me for a long time. Then he said something I haven't been able to forget. So the people who made this mess already have lifeboats, and guys like me are still on the deck of the Titanic being told everything's fine. That's exactly right. The British banker Harold Whitmore, who stood on the London Stock Exchange floor in 1945, retired in 1982, having lost 94% of his purchasing power. His grandson Thomas Whitmore works in finance in Singapore today, as far from the pound as he can get. History doesn't repeat, but it echoes. And right now the echo is deafening. We've traced the mechanism. We've identified the breaking point. We've exposed who benefits and who pays. But we haven't yet examined the specific timeline, the convergence of forces that makes 2027 the mathematical endpoint of this cycle. What happens when $7.6 trillion in Treasury debt comes due in a single year? What happens when interest payments consume 30% of federal revenue? What happens when the network effect breaks and the dollar loses critical mass? The answer is not theoretical. We have a case study. We have Britain from 1956 to 1992, and the numbers are worse than you think. The British pound did not collapse on October 30th, 1956. That's the part nobody tells you. The day after Eden withdrew from Suez, the pound was still the second most held reserve currency on earth. British banks still processed billions in international transactions. The City of London still employed hundreds of thousands of financial professionals. If you had walked through Threadneedle Street that November morning, nothing would have looked different. The dying had already begun. It just wasn't visible yet. This is how reserve currencies actually die. Not in explosions, in slow suffocation. Let me show you the trajectory. In 1956, the British pound represented 30% of global foreign exchange reserves. By 1967, 11 years later, it had fallen to 14%. By 1977, 7%. By 1987, 3%. By 2000, less than 5%. If you visualize this on a chart, the line doesn't crash. It bleeds. A slow diagonal descent across 4 decades each year, slightly worse than the last. Each generation, slightly poorer than their parents. What does that look like in human terms? Arthur Blackwood was 32 years old in 1956, a machinist at a Birmingham automobile factory, earning what he considered a comfortable wage. He owned a small house. His wife didn't need to work. He was saving for his children's education. By 1976, Arthur was 52. The same job adjusted for inflation paid 40% less in real terms. His wife had taken a part-time position. His children's university fees had tripled. The house he bought in 1954 for $1,800 was now worth $12,000, but that wasn't wealth creation. That was currency destruction. The numbers got bigger while the purchasing power got smaller. Arthur retired in 1989 with a pension that bought roughly 1/3 of what he'd been promised when he started working. Now contrast that with someone who understood what was happening. Sir James Goldsmith was 23 in 1956, the same year as the Suez Crisis. While most British investors kept their wealth in pound-denominated assets, Goldsmith began systematically moving capital into gold foreign currencies and international businesses. By 1976, when Arthur Blackwood's real wages had collapsed by 40%, Goldsmith's net worth had increased 800%. By 1987, he was one of the richest men in Europe. Same economy, same time frame, opposite outcomes. The difference was not luck. The difference was understanding the mechanism. Here's what most people get wrong about currency decline. They imagine it affects everyone equally. It doesn't. Currency decline is the most efficient wealth transfer mechanism ever invented. It moves purchasing power from people who hold the dying currency to people who hold real assets or foreign currencies. The transfer is invisible. There's no robbery, no confiscation, no dramatic moment where someone takes your money. You simply wake up each year slightly poorer while a small percentage of people who understood the game wake up slightly richer. Remember Victoria Langston from Part 3, the Swiss bank compliance officer who reported a 400% increase in offshore account applications from U.S. government officials. The same pattern played out in Britain during the 1960s and 1970s. The people who created the crisis protected themselves from its consequences. The people who trusted the system paid the price. Now let me ask you a question. If the dollar follows the same trajectory as the pound, and every indicator suggests it will, what does America look like in 2037? The mathematics are not complicated. In 2027, the United States must refinance $7.6 trillion in maturing Treasury debt. Current interest rates mean that debt will refinance at roughly double the original rates. Interest payments, which already exceed $1 trillion annually, will spike toward $1.8 trillion. That's 35% of all federal tax revenue consumed by interest alone. Money that produces nothing, builds nothing, employs no one. Margaret Chen, the Goldman Treasury analyst from Part 1, who watched foreign central banks walking toward the exits, ran these projections last year. When she finished, she sat alone in her office for 20 minutes before sending the report to her managing director. Her conclusion was 3 sentences. The debt trajectory is nonlinear. By 2030, interest payments will exceed defense spending. By 2034, they will exceed Social Security. The federal government will face a choice that is actually no choice at all. Cut spending by 40%, triggering immediate recession and social unrest. Raise taxes by 40%, triggering capital flight and economic collapse. Or print more money, accelerating the very currency decline that created the crisis. Every path leads to the same destination. Lower living standards for Americans who hold dollars, but not for everyone. David Park is 41 years old, a software architect in Austin, Texas. Over the past 3 years, he has systematically converted 60% of his net worth into what he calls post-dollar assets. Singapore dollars, Swiss francs, gold, Bitcoin, and rental property in Portugal. His strategy is simple. I watched what happened to my grandparents in Korea during the Asian financial crisis, he told me. Their savings evaporated in 6 months. I'm not going to let that happen to my family. By 2034, if the dollar follows the pound's trajectory, David's diversified portfolio will have preserved approximately 85% of its purchasing power. His neighbor, a dentist with $1.2 million in treasury bonds and dollar-denominated retirement accounts, will have preserved approximately 40%. Same street, same time frame. One family thrives. One family struggles to maintain their lifestyle. Here's the first twist that should disturb you. The Federal Reserve knows this. Treasury officials know this. The economic advisors in Washington have run the same projections David Park ran. They understand that Americans holding dollar assets will lose purchasing power over the next decade. They are not warning the public. They are not recommending diversification. They are telling Americans that Treasury bonds remain the safest investment on earth. Remember Daniel Morrison from Part 3. The Ohio history teacher with $180,000 in Treasury bonds who realized he was still on the Titanic, while the architects of the crisis were already in lifeboats. His trajectory is mathematically predictable. If the dollar loses 30% of its purchasing power over the next decade, which is optimistic, given historical precedents, his $180,000 will buy approximately $126,000 worth of goods in $2,034. If inflation accelerates, which it likely will during a reserve currency transition, the number drops below $100,000. Meanwhile, the hedge fund managers, the private equity partners, the sovereign wealth fund operators, the people who understand the mechanism will have converted their wealth into assets that benefit from dollar decline. Real estate in strong currency zones. Commodities. Gold. Equity in multinational corporations that earn revenue in multiple currencies. This is not speculation. This is what happened in Britain. The wealthy got wealthier. The middle class got poorer. The working class got devastated. Sir Arthur Lewis, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, studied British living standards from 1956 to 1980. His conclusion was blunt. The average British worker lost 23% of real income over this period, while the top 1% saw real wealth increase by 47%. The reserve currency collapse didn't create poverty equally. It redistributed wealth upward with mechanical precision. The second twist is even darker. The timeline I've described, gradual decline over 2 decades, assumes no major shock. No war. No financial crisis. No sudden loss of confidence. Britain's decline was relatively orderly because there was a ready replacement. The US dollar was waiting to absorb global demand. What replaces the dollar? The yuan is not freely convertible. The euro has structural weaknesses. Bitcoin is too volatile. Gold cannot scale to modern transaction volumes. For the first time in modern history, a reserve currency may decline without a clear successor. This does not make the dollar safe. It makes the transition more chaotic. Instead of an orderly handoff, we may see fragmentation, multiple regional currencies competing payment systems, a breakdown of the unified global financial system that has existed since 1944. The implications of that fragmentation are beyond the scope of this video. But the immediate implications, the ones that will affect your savings, your retirement, your children's future, those are clear. The pattern is set. The mechanism is running. The question is no longer whether America will follow Britain's path. The question is what you do with the years you have left before 2027 becomes 2037. Let's return to where we started. The London Stock Exchange, October 1945. Harold Whitmore, 34 years old, standing beneath marble columns carved with the names of colonial territories, holding settlement documents worth £12 million. Absolute certainty in his posture. The British Empire had just won a world war. The pound sterling had dominated global finance for 2 centuries. The system was permanent. I told you Harold retired in 1982, having watched the pound lose 94% of its purchasing power. But I didn't tell you what happened in between. In 1967, Harold was 56. His son Peter had just been accepted to Cambridge. That same year, Prime Minister Harold Wilson announced a 14% devaluation of the pound, the largest single-day currency drop in British history. Peter's tuition, priced in dollars for the International Economics Program, increased overnight. Harold sold the family's vacation cottage in Cornwall to cover the difference. In 1976, Harold was 65. Britain had gone to the International Monetary Fund for an emergency bailout, the first developed nation to do so. The conditions were humiliating. Spending cuts, austerity measures, a formal acknowledgement that Britain could no longer manage its own economy without foreign supervision. Harold's pension, which he had calculated to provide comfortable retirement, was now worth less than a junior banker's starting salary. In 1982, when Harold finally retired, his grandson Thomas was 12 years old. Thomas watched his grandfather, a man who had spent his entire career at one of the most prestigious banks in the British Empire, count coins at the grocery store. Thomas Whitmore is 65 today. He lives in Singapore. He hasn't held British pounds as a primary currency in 30 years. The pattern completes itself across generations. Now let me show you what's happening right now in real time as you watch this video. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet, if you visualize it on a timeline from 2008 to 2024, looks like a hockey stick lying on its side. Flat for decades, then a vertical spike that hasn't returned to baseline. $900 billion in 2008. $8.9 trillion at the peak in 2022. A partial reduction to $7.4 trillion today, still 8 times higher than pre-crisis levels. Meanwhile, foreign central bank holdings of Treasury bonds continue their quiet descent. The chart Margaret Chen showed her Goldman Sachs colleagues, the one with the line bending downward, hasn't reversed. China, Japan, Saudi Arabia, Brazil, India. The largest holders of American debt are methodically reducing exposure. And in March 2024, something happened that received almost no mainstream coverage. BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, plus new members, Iran, Egypt, Ethiopia, and the UAE, announced preliminary frameworks for a cross-border payment system that bypasses the dollar entirely. Not replacing the dollar, routing around it. Here's the contrarian point that cuts against everything I've told you. The dollar might not follow the pound's exact timeline. It might be faster. It might be slower. Economic systems are not physics equations. There are variables we cannot predict: technological disruptions, political realignments, black swan events that reshape everything. What we can predict is the pattern. And the pattern across 500 years of monetary history has never once failed to complete itself. Remember the question I asked in part 2. If America could weaponize the dollar against Britain in 1956, could someone weaponize it against America today? The answer is more nuanced than yes or no. No single nation can crash the dollar the way Eisenhower crashed the pound. But collective action, a coordinated move by major holders to reduce dollar exposure simultaneously, could trigger the same cascading loss of confidence. That coordination is happening. Slowly, quietly, methodically. Ahmed Al-Rashid, the Gulf Sovereign Wealth Fund manager, who mentioned his instructions to reduce dollar exposure by 3% annually, he's not unique. He's representative. Multiply his mandate across dozens of sovereign wealth funds, 100 central banks, thousands of institutional investors, all receiving variations of the same instruction, and you begin to see the mechanism in motion. I want to be clear about what this video is and what it isn't. This is not a prediction that the dollar will collapse on a specific date. Anyone who tells you they know exactly when and how a reserve currency transition will occur is selling something. The British Treasury didn't know in 1955 that Suez would break them in 1956. The mechanism was in place, but the trigger was unpredictable. This is a pattern recognition exercise, the same pattern that has repeated across the Spanish peso, the Dutch guilder, the British pound is now visible in the American dollar. Every checkbox is marked. Unpayable debt, unprecedented money printing, loss of creditor confidence, geopolitical overreach, domestic division, emerging alternatives, the petrodollar's slow erosion. The question is not whether you believe the pattern will complete. The question is what you do with that information. There's a framework, not financial advice, just questions worth asking. First, what percentage of your wealth exists only as numbers in accounts denominated in a single currency? Second, if that currency lost 30% of its purchasing power over the next decade, how would your life change? Third, do the people who designed this system have their wealth structured the same way they're telling you to structure yours? Victoria Langston's statistic keeps echoing. 400% increase in offshore accounts from U.S. government officials between 2016 and 2021. They're not telling you to diversify. They're diversifying themselves. Daniel Morrison, the Ohio history teacher with his retirement savings in treasury bonds, asked me what he should do. I told him I couldn't give financial advice. He laughed, not with humor, with recognition. The people who can give advice, he said, are the same people who created this mess. He's not wrong. Robert Blackwell, the retired Fed official with the trembling hands, reached out to me one final time before this video was completed. He wanted to add something to his earlier comments. "The system isn't broken," he said. "It's working exactly as designed. It just wasn't designed for people like us." If you take nothing else from this video, take that. Reserve currencies don't fail by accident. They fail because the privilege they create is too tempting to resist. The ability to print money and have the world accept it, the ability to borrow without consequences, the ability to export inflation and import prosperity. No government in history has been able to resist abusing that privilege. And no government in history has survived the consequences. Britain didn't disappear in 1956. British people still exist. British culture still thrives. But the empire, the dominance, the extraordinary privilege that allowed a small island to rule a quarter of the earth that ended. Not with a bang, with a phone call and a 40-year decline. America will not disappear. Americans will not vanish. But the version of America that borrows 40 cents of every dollar it spends, that prints money without consequence, that maintains 800 military bases on borrowed time and borrowed currency, that America is approaching its Suez moment. The clock is not a metaphor. 2027 is not a symbol. The mathematics are specific. The timeline is measurable, and the pattern is older than any nation currently on Earth. History doesn't repeat. But it echoes loud enough that only the deliberately deaf cannot hear it. The trap has been sprung. The question is whether you're Harold Whitmore in 1945, certain the system will last forever, or Thomas Whitmore in 2024, who learned from his grandfather's certainty and moved to Singapore. The choice is yours. The clock is not.